Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Incoherence of the Philosophers by Al-ghazali. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing it any differently. I don't know how to say his name. Al-ghazali. Sorry. No. Al-ghazali will do. We're doing the Incoherence of the Philosophers Discussion 1 on refuting their doctrine of the world's past eternity. First, the introduction. Al-ghazali was a Muslim philosopher living in the late 11th and early 12th century. He was also a theologian and a mystic, though those are not areas that I will be getting into. He was also a nominalist and occasionalist. He didn't think that there were any kind of mind-independent universals, and he also thought that God was the immediate cause of everything and that he didn't use secondary causes in any way. That's his full name right there. I'm not saying that as it says in the slides. And the book that we're going to be looking at is devoted to refuting the Aristotelian school of the time, the Philosophers, which I will also not be pronouncing correctly. But they had a bunch of weird heresies, which are heresies both by Muslim and Catholic standards, so we'll be having a good time. Today, the doctrine to be refuted is that the world has existed with God from all eternity with no temporal beginning. The world has existed with God from all eternity with no temporal beginning. This is a big heresy. Don't believe this, kids. I wrote out two different versions of the argument because there are two interrelated but slightly distinct arguments here. The first version goes, for God to create the world at some point in the past, there would need to be a change in God. God cannot change, therefore God did not create the world at some point in the past. And then version 2 says, if the world goes from not existing to existing, there needs to be a sufficient reason for the change. There can be no sufficient reason because God's nature is constant, the possibility of the world is constant, and God's will is constant. So the world did not go from not existing to existing. There is going to be two distinct lines of argument against this, two objections that Al-ghazali raises. The first one is that, what if there is an eternal will in God, which eternally wills that creation begin at a certain time? It gives a sufficient reason for the change in the world. It doesn't introduce a change in God, and it has nothing to do with the possibility of the world staying constant. There's no reason God couldn't will from all eternity that at 2 o'clock on Tuesday the universe begin to exist. This is the response from the Aristotelian. Intentions are only delayed by impediments, but there could be no impediment to God's willing of the world because there can be nothing which impedes God in any way. As a result of this, there cannot be a delayed will to create the world from God's perspective. The response to this is that God's will is different from our will, while we may have these issues where the only reason we delay the willing of something is because we are incapable of attaining it right now. There's no reason that God necessarily has the exact same kind of will as we do. There's no demonstration that something willed from eternity cannot have a temporal effect. That will be something that they need to prove, not something that we just assume. And you not liking this is tough, but, who cares? Then there's the concluding part of this dialectic. The Aristotelian says, it is simply known from the terms that we are correct, that something from eternity cannot be willed in the temporal realm. And Al-ghazali says, I think it is simply known that the terms of knowledge that God cannot know all things without his essence having some division or accident is simply true. Al-ghazali is saying here that if we're just going to appeal to whatever we feel like, then I'll just appeal to the fact that I feel like you're wrong about the nature of God's knowledge. And the Aristotelian says that God simply knows himself, to which Al-ghazali responds, then God does not know creation, which is impossible, for it is impossible to create something without knowing that which you create. Then Al-ghazali posts, I hate myself so much. Then Al-Ghazali writes an argument against the eternity of the past. The sun rotates around the Earth once a year, and Saturn rotates around the Earth 30 times a year. If the world is past eternal, then they have both rotated around the Earth the same number of times despite rotating at different speeds. The sun and Saturn have not rotated around the Earth the same number of times, so the world is not past eternal. Furthermore, if Saturn has rotated around the Earth a number of times, then the number is odd or even. If the number of rotations is infinite, then it is neither odd nor even. Therefore, either there is not a number of times that Saturn has rotated around the Earth, or the number is not infinite. There is a number of times Saturn has rotated around the Earth, therefore the number is not infinite. There are responses to this from the Aristotelian. The category of odds and evens does not apply to infinite magnitudes. You can say that we have this category of odd and even, but it only applies to finite numbers. Al-Ghazali then adds that if we admit an infinite history of the universe, then the Aristotelian will also have to admit that it's possible for there to be an infinite number of things existing at the same time, which is something they deny. The reason for this is that souls exist permanently. After a human dies, their soul continues. And if you had an infinite history of the universe, then you could have an infinite history of humans producing other humans. And while other material things might pass away, there would be an infinite production of souls in the infinite history of that universe, and thus an infinite number of concurrently existing things. Now we have the conclusion of the dialectic on the soul. The Aristotelian says that there is actually only one soul, and when everyone dies, their soul is reabsorbed back into the megasoul. I believe this view comes from Avicenna. Al-Ghazali says different souls have different processes at different times. If there was only one soul, then they would all have to be having the same processes done continuously. Also, the Aristotelian was appealing to matter to individuate or differentiate the souls from each other while they were instantiated. However, Al-Ghazali thinks it's nonsense to say that something which is purely material can individuate something which is immaterial, namely the soul. Then the Aristotelian says they are only differentiated when embodied, they return upon death, and Al-Ghazali says that's nonsense. Only quantitative parts, such as the quantities of water, are capable of returning to wholes. You can't take two humans, which are qualitatively different, put them together, and get a larger human whole. Only quantitative parts can be turned into bigger wholes. Qualitative parts, different humans, cannot be smushed together and turned into another human, which is slightly bigger. As cool as that would be. The Aristotelian then puts up another argument, which is, if God refrained from creating for a time, then either God refrained from creating for a finite period of time, or God refrained from creating for an infinite period of time. If A, then God failed to exist prior to the creation of the world. This is because there would only be a finite amount of time prior to the creation of the world where God refrained from creating it. But God has existed for all eternity, so there couldn't be a merely finite time prior to the creation of the world, because that would imply that God was only around for a finite time prior to the creation of the world, whereas God has existed for all eternity. God can't fail to exist, so A is false. And if B is the case, then you are already committed to an endless history of events, which you have argued is impossible. So, either way, there is an eternal history, and you're committed to denying that, so your view is nonsense. Al-Ghazali is going to deny the exclusivity of the disjunction in premise 1. Either he created it a finite time ago, or an infinite amount of time has passed. The out that Al-Ghazali gives himself is saying that God does not exist in any kind of time. and that God created time and duration with the world. God exists outside of time. He exists in eternity, whereas us creatures exist in time. So prior to the creation of the world, God didn't desist for any amount of time because time did not exist yet. Then we have the end of the dialectic on the will of God. If God is capable of creating the world at any point in its history, why did he create it at one time rather than another? Al-Ghazali says the will has the power of differentiating things which are similar, so he just decided to create it at one time rather than another. And the Aristotelian says it's impossible to differentiate two similars, for they have no distinguishing characteristics. So there could be nothing in God which differentiated between two identical states of the world. There are two responses to this. First, similarity does not obtain, and second, even if it did, the will could choose between two similars. And second, if it's impossible for anything, either the will, chance, or necessity, to discern between two similars, then the universal order posited by the Aristotelian will fall to the same issue. They say that everything's necessary, but if space is absolute, then there could be no reason why all of the planets are placed at these points in space rather than at other points. And if time is absolute, then there could be no reason why the events taking place now are taking place now and not 20 minutes ago, because each moment of time is identical. Why wasn't the entire history of the universe taking place 20 minutes earlier rather than the place that it's taking now? There is a second objection to the original arguments for the infinite history of the world. Yes, all of this so far has constituted a single objection. Don't worry, this won't happen again. If the history of the world is beginningless, there can be no reason for believing in God, because God, hypothetically, is the first cause of the world. You believe in God, and you believe you can know God by reason. Therefore, you cannot believe in a beginningless world. To this, the Aristotelian has no response. We have now made it, finally, to the second proof for the pre-eternity of the world that the Aristotelian will be positing. The argument runs thusly. If God is prior to the world, he is prior either essentially or temporally. Essentially would be like a Pedicet-ordered causal series, or the example given in the book is the way that the number 1 is prior to the number 2. Or he could be prior in time. If he is prior essentially, then the world is eternal for a thing which is essentially prior to its consequent, is eternally prior to its consequent, and the consequent eternally obtains. Then, if he is prior temporally, then the world and time were created at some point. Prior to that point, he must have existed for some duration of time. But then time would exist before time existed, so he could not be temporally prior. The objection that Al-Ghazali has to this is that God created both the world and time, and before time there was no duration or other things. Prior to the creation of the world, there was just God alone and a lack of other things. This can be read as denying either premise 3 or premise 2. As denying premise 3, it denies that there would be some time before creation. As denying premise 2, it would be denying the connection between the antecedent and the consequent, namely, that if he's prior essentially, then the world is eternal. Al-Ghazali sees no reason to suppose this. The word was signifies a temporal state prior to the current one. So if you say God was alone before creation, then God existed at a time prior to creation. And then Al-Ghazali says, we're just incapable of comprehending things outside of time. The same way we couldn't imagine what it would be like beyond the boundaries of physical space, we can't imagine what it would be like beyond the boundaries of temporal existence. Just as time is the measure of motion, space is the measure of extension. And just as we can't picture a lack of space, we also can't picture a lack of time. That doesn't mean a lack of time is impossible. That just means that we don't understand it. Then there is a second argument here based on time. God could have created a world that was 1,100 years old and one that was 1,200 years old. He could create them so that the elapsing of the 1,100th year and of the 1,200th year happened on the exact same day. But Because they are different worlds with different times, this means that 100 years was capable of passing in eternity, where there was not supposed to be able to be any time that passed at all. The response to this is that time is relative. If the two universes are entirely unconnected, then there's no meaningful sense in which the 1100th year and the 1200th year end at the same day. If they're entirely unconnected, there's no way that you can say it's the same day that happens. If there is a meaningful sense in which that happens, then it's relative to the beginning of the universe and not some hypothetical time which takes place in eternity. Then we have the third proof, which is blessedly short. If God created the world with a temporal beginning, then prior to that point the world was impossible. The world has been possible for all eternity, therefore the world did not have any temporal beginning. Al-Ghazali says, there is no connection between the antecedent and consequent of premise 1, which is to say, just because the world had a temporal beginning, that doesn't mean it was impossible before it was created. Then the fourth and final proof. The possibility of changeable things is grounded in the existence of matter. So this is to say that things are only possible, these changing things are only possible because matter exists. Possibility is not something which exists out in the world by itself. Possibility requires something else to exist in. So the possibility of changeable things is existing in matter. The Aristotelian also says that matter cannot be merely possible because there would be nothing in reality that could be a receptacle for the possibility of matter. Okay, back to the original argument. The possibility of changeable things is grounded in the existence of matter. Physical things have been possible from all eternity, therefore matter has existed from all eternity. There is the response. Possibility is not just reducible to matter, possibility is rather the judgments of things that the mind is capable of conceiving. There is also this problem of impossibilities. What is the receptacle for an impossibility? Impossible things are like, there are true statements about impossibilities. You can't have a square circle, you can't have a married bachelor. So what is the receptacle for these impossibilities? And then finally, some things are judged to be possible prior to their existing, such as colors. You can judge that it's possible for a thing to be black or white prior to it actually being black or white. Then there is a counterexample, which is that of souls. Souls are not material, and the Aristotelian accepts this. So this is a counterexample to premise 1, which says the possibility of changeable things is grounded in the existence of matter. This is an immaterial thing, it is changeable, and it does not exist in any way in matter, but it is possible. The Aristotelian has a lot of responses here. First, all knowledge is knowledge of some object. This means that there has to be an object of the knowledge of possibility. Impossibility has a receptacle. That is, the objects which are conflated to produce it. So impossibility is what happens when you take two individually possible things and you try to shove them together in the same spot where they don't belong, like putting a square and a circle into the same object. Blackness is only possible in a receptacle, not by itself, so judging it to be possible is just a judgment about matter. There is an interesting question that I had here, which Al-Ghazali doesn't flag, which is that, does this impossibility of blackness existing in itself have a receptacle? Because that wouldn't be a case of two contraries existing in the same object if blackness were to exist by itself. Then 4, if the soul originates from matter, its possibility is in matter. If the soul does not originate from matter, it is at least related to matter as controller to controlled, for the soul creates matter. Al-Ghazali's final responses in this section are that modal judgments are abstractions that have no objects, similar to the way we abstract universals from particulars. And he has this parallel dialogue, which goes, if genera and species only exist in the mind, then modality only exists in the mind as well. If you say that if we removed all of the minds from reality, then genera and species would still exist in the mind of God, then modal judgments about what is possible and impossible and necessary would also exist in the mind of God. Next, impossibility is not always referred back to impossibilities in matter. For example, no contrary is violated when we say that God exists with another God, but this is impossible. It's impossible for there to be more than one God, so there's no contradiction found in matter here. This is similar to the case, where is the impossibility of the idea that matter, or that blackness has no receptacle? Where's the receptacle for blackness requiring matter to exist? And then Al-ghazali says the answers about the soul are nonsense. The soul does not originate from matter. No Aristotelian believes this. And the soul just controlling matter gives no explanation for its possibility. Then we have the final complaint of the sobbing Aristotelian. He has been absolutely destroyed. But you didn't offer any alternative. You just raised a bunch of problems. You didn't give us any solutions. Yeah, I'm just messing with you, mate. We'll be talking about that some other time. And then he says we'll read it in another book. Oh, man. It's called We Do a Little Trolling. We do a little trolling. I hope you learned something.